Padre Pio's San Giovanni. Padre Pio said, "I can refuse no one. How could I, if the good Lord wills it and refuses me nothing when I ask him?" And so it would seem. The countless people who came to see him in his lifetime did not come out of curiosity or even devotion, but because they, like each of us today, were in need of the healing of mind, body, and spirit, which all of us seek, and which came to them through the intercession of this humble Franciscan priest, the Friar of San Giovanni. As he said, "I can refuse no one. How could I, if the good Lord wills it and refuses me nothing?" Who was Padre Pio? The story begins here in the obscure, isolated village of Pietrelcina in the province of Benevento in the southern part of Italy. In this house in 1887, Francis Forgione was born of simple, humble parents. He would have played in the narrow streets, as these children are now. But from the age of 5, he seems to have recognized and accepted the invitation to walk in the footsteps of Christ in order to save souls. His ambition to become a Capuchin, initially childishly because they wore beards, was realized, and he was ordained in the cathedral in Benevento on August the 10th, 1910. From the window of the little family house, he could view the rolling plains of Piano Romano. This simple room was the birthplace of one of the greatest mystics of this century. In that same year, he was to receive the invisible stigmata, and the villagers built this little chapel to enclose the tree under which he had felt the acute pains of the wounds of Christ. To improve his health, he was sent to the mountain friary of San Giovanni, and although he begged God to continue to allow him to suffer secretly, to his great dismay, the wounds were fully and permanently imprinted on his body in the choir loft of the church on September the 20th, 1918. His desire to walk in the footsteps of Christ to Calvary had been accepted. And he bore the wounds until shortly before he died, 50 years later. Some of the garments he wore, such as the mittens which covered his stigmatized hands, his nightshirt which bore the wounds of the scourging, and the sandals for his swollen feet, are preserved in the friary in Pietrelcina and San Giovanni. As a true Franciscan, he followed his angelic founder in comforting his crucified Savior. The Church of Our Lady of the Angels in the village where he was born contains this beautiful statue of Our Lady, venerated in the past in thanksgiving for liberation from attack from the Emperor Constantine, as well as deliverance from plague. His devotion to Mary and to her rosary became a constant and never-ending aspect of his life. He was never without the rosary in his hand. "There is nothing that you cannot obtain through the hands of Our Lady," he would tell his devotees as he demonstrated by his endless recitation of this prayer. He would bless their rosaries, reminding them that the rosary is the weapon against evil. He recommended it to all who asked for his help. Even in death, it was his sword and his shield. Another man with a great devotion to Our Lady and the Rosary and who attended Padre Pio's daily Mass is Vincenzo.
Mi chiamo Vincenzo, sono cieco nato.
He is today a familiar figure praying his rosary as he walks the shrine. A rosary he will never see, for he is blind. Here he tells us how much Padre Pio still means to him and how he used to meet him daily before his Mass. I used to position myself every day, he says, to be sure to see Padre Pio on his way to Mass and to kiss his hands. On one occasion I failed to kiss the Padre's hands, and to my surprise, Padre Pio turned round and said, "So this little savage has learnt not to kiss my hand, has he?" and laughed loudly before turning back to offer his hand, which I kissed with gratitude. Vincenzo, who was a teacher of philosophy and art, was brought for the first time to see Padre Pio by his brother-in-law, Umberto. He frequently went to confession to Padre Pio, and on several occasions remarked how the air around the friar in the confessional was heavy with a sweet perfume, a phenomenon experienced by many people both when he was still alive and since his death. After confession one day, he told Padre Pio he was worried about Umberto, who was seriously ill. Padre Pio told him to pray and not to worry. 5 days later, he met his brother-in-law, who had dramatically recovered. Umberto told him that Padre Pio came to him in a dream, held his hand and comforted him, and he quickly felt well again. So he went to San Giovanni to thank Padre Pio. "Don't thank me," said Padre Pio. "Thank Our Lady." As news of the stigmatized friar leaked out, the tide of needy and suffering humanity seeking help arrived from all corners of the earth. Wherever he went, hands reached out, pleading for help, for solace, for the healing which only God can provide, as if he were a touchstone of grace. From the neighboring parish of San Marco, Padre Peter Villani had, as a boy, walked the 12 kilometers over the mountain to Mass, often serving on the altar. After he was ordained as a Verona father, he was for many years a missionary in Africa. However, some years later, it was while he was working in a parish in Italy that it was discovered that his mother was suffering from throat cancer.
It was in 1948 when a friend of mine told me that my mother was with cancer. So I came to see Padre Pio and asked where to go. Padre Pio gave me an address of a Roman specialist. The day after we were in Rome, and to the doctor I said, "Look, it is Padre Pio who is sending me and my mother here to you. My mother is with cancer, so please try to do your best to help her."
Sadly, the news was not good. His mother's cancer was in fact inoperable.
So I left my mother and came straight to the monastery to see Padre Pio. I knew that Padre Pio in that moment at about 4:30 should have been in the monastery garden. So I said, "Father, what am I to do?" And he said, "Well, you may go. I will be here." For nearly a month, I didn't hear any news at all about my mother. We are on the main road from San Giovanni to Padre Pio's monastery, and behind me, under that tree, there is my mother's house, where I came when my sister didn't ring me or send me a letter to let me know how my mother was. When I came here, I knocked the door, opened it, and lo and below, I found my mother sweeping the room, sweeping the floor. I was delighted, and kissing her, I went straight to thank Padre Pio at the monastery. I fenced my way through the crowd of men in this sacristy and met Padre Pio just here, who was washing his fingers before going to give communion. And I asked him if he could hear my confession, and said, yes, quickly, you see. And after my confession, after absolution, he asked me, Peter, did you see your mother? Oh, yes, I said, yes, Father. And pretending not to know anything about it, he asked me, and how is she? Father, I said, she is very well indeed. And Padre Pio, patting on my shoulder, said, well, I saw that you were upset. Your sister was even worse. So, well, thanks be to God. Thanks be to God. And for this, I'm very grateful to Padre Pio, because he gave me back my mother for 7 years more. Impossible to forget Padre Pio and not be grateful.
By now, news of the graces granted through his intercession had spread throughout the world, often through the prayer groups which he had inspired. Letters, many of them containing offerings, poured into the friary. His first thought was for the sick of the area, whose needs had scarcely been met by this small dispensary in the town. Even when this was moved to a larger house, the provision proved inadequate, and so it was decided to obtain permission to erect a large hospital for the people of that deprived part of Italy. A site was obtained and marked out. Work began in levelling this rocky terrain opposite the friary itself. The foundations were soon visible for the expectant townsfolk to survey. At last it was finished, and in 1956 Padre Pio blessed it in the presence of the principals of his order and the town's dignitaries. He cut the tape of the finished building, which we now see in its present state. The main collaborators in this monumental task, commemorated by busts in the hospital entrance, were Dr. Sanguinetti, his personal physician and friend, and the distinguished architect Angelo Lupi, whose inscription reads, "Padre Pio called me. My response is this building for the relief of suffering." One of the most eloquent statues in the hospital depicts Padre Pio as the unique, world-renowned confessor to whom so many had come to be healed of their spiritual ills. St. Francis looks down from the roof on this, one of the greatest Franciscan works of mercy. On the first anniversary of the opening of the hospital, Padre Pio read out the other projects which were soon underway, such as the homes and rehabilitation centres for hundreds of spastic children, a home for retired priests, and accommodation for the old and sick. Thus his prophecy that from this original small building, the friary, there would arise a city on a mountain, which became the San Giovanni we know today. Naturally, every visitor to San Giovanni wished to attend Padre Pio's Mass. It was like hearing Mass for the first time as he approached the altar, and so began his journey to Calvary in the painful steps of his Lord and Master. One of his spiritual children declared that it was as if one was present at the crucifixion, death, and resurrection of our Saviour. The Mass could last for several hours, as Padre Pio frequently went into ecstasy at the consecration. His tears, as he witnessed and shared in the agony and the passion, moved the congregation beyond measure. How could his heart hold all that emotion without breaking? How could that little 16th century church hold all the crowds who came from far and wide to assist at his Mass? Many had to be content with his blessing as they stood on the piazza below. A larger adjacent church was begun. The front adorned by a beautiful statue of Our Lady. It was dedicated to Our Lady of Grace and was finished in 1958. And the beautiful mosaic above the altar also depicts the angels to whom Padre Pio had such devotion. More and more, the people flocked to this out-of-the-way region like flecks of steel to a magnet. The new church was soon as much under pressure as the old, the pilgrims filling every inch of space as before. Here, at his last Mass on earth, the priest who had offered up every drop of his blood for the salvation of souls offers his final remembrance of the Last Supper of the Lord. As he turned to leave the altar, in his extreme weakness, he stumbled. And Father Joseph Pius, then known as Brother Bill, was as ever by his side to support him. Padre Pio knew that it was the last time he would see his beloved children, as he called those who shared in his Mass. And as he left, he cried out, "My children, my children." His children, his spiritual children, were legion, for he had been spiritual director to many in his lifetime. In the second book of his letters, which are to one of his spiritual daughters, Raffaella Cerese, we find the compassionate, loving, wise counsel which we all seek. And those who even now request to be registered as his spiritual children know the measure of that love. Many, like the Bianchi family from America, here in front of the Church of Our Lady of Grace, have reason to be thankful to their spiritual father, as their daughter Annaretha explains.
Padre Pio is a bit of a romantic, I guess you could say, because he was a matchmaker for many couples, and one of those couples was our mother and father. At Father Pio's 5 o'clock Mass in the morning, they found themselves standing next to each other. And my father noticed my mother and kind of peered over to see what language her missal was written in and saw that it was in German. So he decided to approach her. And my mother saw him coming and thought, oh, great, one of these Italians. So she kind of prepared herself and said, but wait, I've just come out of church. I better be charitable. My father just casually asked for her address. And my mother, thinking not much of it, gave him her address and really didn't take it seriously at all. Marriage was out of the question for her. And so she went back to Germany and pretty much forgot about him. But my father had been deeply moved by my mother's love for God and love for the Blessed Mother, and was touched so much because she had been the first woman that had ever asked him to pray a rosary with him. And so when he went to confession to Padre Pio, he told Padre Pio about this beautiful lady from Germany that he met. And he asked, "Is it God's will that we be married?" And Padre Pio said, "Yes, it is God's will that you be married." And he told her, "Look, Father Pio said that it's God's will that we be married." And my mother said, "What? Father Pio said what? Wait a minute here. I have to go check out and find out for myself if this is really true. Who is this, he telling me to marry you?" So she vowed that she would go down there and find out for herself. And so they took the next train down to San Giovanni Rotondo, and my mother and father went into a hallway where Padre Pio was walking down. He stopped in front of them, and they were both kneeling on the ground. And he placed his hand on the head of my father, not saying a word. And he placed his hand on my mother's head, not saying a word either. And my mother said that as he placed the hand on her head, she felt such a sense of peace overcome her that she didn't have 1 ounce of courage inside of her to say one word about, "What's this you've telling me to get married?" She knew at that moment, as he put the hand on her head, that it was God's will that they be married. And so 1 month before Padre Pio died, in August of 1968, my mother and father were happily married in the old church. And Father Pio blessed them on their wedding day and blessed their wedding rings. And although he was very sick and didn't write much at that time, or say any more at wedding ceremonies, they were especially honored because he signed a beautiful picture of Our Lady of Grace and said, "May our dear Lady protect and guide you throughout your life." And I guess the best way to end the story would be to say, Padre Pio, we thank you. Padre Pio, we love you.
When Padre Pio died on September the 23rd, 1968, people still in San Giovanni, celebrating the 50th year of his stigmatization, were stunned as the news spread through the crowds. Their grief was great, for they had lost a loved friend and advocate. As he lay in his coffin, countless thousands filed past to pay their last respects. And by the time of the funeral, 100,000 of his devotees had amassed from all over the world. It was expected that the flow of pilgrims would then decline. But year by year, the numbers increase. The young, the people in the midst of their lives and careers, and the old continue to flock to his tomb. It is a beacon of light and hope in a darkening world. On the occasion of the centenary of his birth, in May 1987, the Holy Father himself made a pastoral visit to San Giovanni and paid homage to the Franciscan Capuchin whom he had visited as a simple priest from Krakow. After Mass in the fields below the Frari, he visited the tomb of his beloved friend and knelt in prayer for several minutes. The friars were delighted by his presence among them. The increased streams of coaches, private cars, and local buses brought ever more groups of pilgrims, for whom hotels and restaurants had to be provided. New roads and car parks for the coaches were necessary. The bare mountain of San Giovanni has fortunately provided the necessary stone for the construction, as well as spacious parking. The provision of the new church is imperative, and this model, the final choice after many such projects, promises a new vision and future for the pilgrims who come here time after time to be spiritually refreshed in the shade of their beloved Padre. As well as the main place of worship, there will be provision for reception areas for different language groups, a confessional hall, a crypt, and a large central crucifix, and of course, a beautiful piazza with views over the Gargano Mountains. And the steel cross marks the spot where the altar will be. During the ceremony of the inauguration, which was held on May the 16th, 1993, Signor Renzo, the architect who designed the Pompidou Center in Paris, explained his plans to the crowd who had gathered at the site. The blessing ceremony was performed by the provincial of the order. Many years ago, Father Joseph Pius came to San Giovanni as a visitor, but stayed to become a friar.
I'm in San Giovanni for about 30 years, save a few years for schooling after Father Pio's death. I was with him the night he died, and a few months after his death, went off to begin my studies for the priesthood. I lived with him the last 3 years of his life. I had come to see him, searching for what I wanted to do in life. He told me to stay, and I did. I went to the Holy Land and came back and felt I had a vocation and packed my bags to go back to America, thinking you were supposed to be in the country of your origin, and went up for his blessing, and he told me to stay. Actually, to come to this site is very interesting because we are now touching on the growing, living history of this San Giovanni Rotondo. When the friars first came here, it was the 16th century. They built a small church. The friars then, when Padre Pio was here, had to build another church because the original one was chapel size, but very lovely. And now we're being forced again, because of Padre Pio's presence, to build another church to accommodate the literally millions of people that come every year to pray at his tomb.
It's a consolation just to see the outlines of the flying buttresses made by these white chalk marks. I'm standing here in the middle of this field. The cross marks the spot where the main altar of this new church will be. Anyone who's been to San Giovanni can attest to the noise and the utter confusion that this place is reduced to during weekends because of the number of people who are coming from literally all over the world. A few years ago, there was a count made based on the people who signed, the names signed in a register book at the tomb, and something like 3,020,000 people came out. That has since gone up in the last several years. From Singapore and Australia and Ireland and England and the United States and Canada, all of you people who have come here for years from around the world and found the difficult conditions and the confused conditions in the existing small church, you will realize very much the need for this. And I want you to think of it as your church, because in reality it is. It's being built for you, to accommodate you, and therefore we ask your assistance in building this church to praise the Lord in the proper circumstances so that we can be quiet in prayer and in homage to Padre Pio, who has done so much for us in the past and is still doing so, and of course will never cease to answer our prayers.
The poor, the suffering, the broken-hearted believe in his promise, and they are not left forsaken. I can refuse no one. How could I if the good Lord wills it and refuses me nothing? This was number 6 in the Seeing is Believing video series. Other titles in the series include number 1, Padre Pio, Pray, Hope and Don't Worry. The story of the stigmatic friar from San Giovanni Rotondo. Number 2, Medjugorje, The Miracles and the Message, including Sister Briege McKenna and Wayne Weibel. Number 3, Sister Faustina, The Promise of Mercy, including the Chaplet of Mercy and the Stations of the Cross. Number 4, At the Gates of Heaven, featuring the latest stage in the beatification process of Padre Pio. Number 5, The Story of Sister Faustina, the Apostle of Divine Mercy, filmed in Poland and Rome. Seeing is Believing video series.